This video is about semiotics and sustainability. Firstly, what is semiotics? It's a method that analyzes signs and meanings in any shape or form. We're used to thinking of signs literally, like traffic signs or emoji, but in semiotic terms it can be actually anything that communicates something, visual or verbal. So semiotics is interested in images, words, but also the wider narratives that people construct to make sense of reality. What's important is that semiotic analysis tends to take into account a specific time and a specific place. It's all contextual. The assumption is that associations change. Sustainability used to mean something very different 50 years ago compared to now. Meanings can also change across cultures, even if they may seem universal. It's all about communication. How we interpret ideas and how we communicate them further, creating shared cultural and social norms. We will also often talk about codes, referring to a collection of signs that communicate a similar idea together. The main difference with traditional qualitative research methods is that semiotics focuses on more unconscious drivers of our opinions and motivations, rather than asking about them directly. It's all about the context of people's lives, which they don't usually think about themselves, but which still impacts their worldview and mental models. Both is needed to get the whole picture. Semiotics looks at stories told by culture. You probably have already seen this New Yorker cover commemorating the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's a perfect example of how both the bottom-up and top-down analysis works. We understand this cover because those two levels of interpretation meet in the middle. On the one hand, the color black is associated with mourning, and the female gender symbols form a lace color. On the other, we are aware of the judge's recent death, her fashion choices and commitment to gender equality. It's all part of the collective understanding in the Western context, which is why no words are needed. Semiotic thinking simply makes this process explicit, so that we can be in charge of those meanings, rather than leave them to our cultural intuition and chance. Sustainability as a concept itself is also made up of such narratives, and the codes that communicate them. The two main questions that we'll focus on throughout this video is what is sustainability and how is it changing, both in different contexts and time. To start with, when we usually think of the word sustainable, it is in opposition to the word wasteful. That's because the Western culture is used to thinking in binary oppositions. But actually, what semiotics encourages you to do is to try to look past that binary and notice that sustainability is more complex than that, with a tool called semiotic square. While it may seem a little intimidating at first, let me guide you through it so that you can appreciate its potential. We start with our binary and extend it with negations of both concepts over here. That forces us to consider what the newly created concepts might mean. In this case, not wasteful could in other words be conserving, and not sustainable, unattainable. Now that we have 4 concepts instead of 2, we can start looking at how they could interact along the sides of the square. Even though we treat them as opposites, it is possible to imagine something that's both sustainable and wasteful at the same time. For example, wind turbines that need to be buried at the end of life, or vegan leather that's made out of plastics. Both of those are examples of tensions which good design strives to resolve. Moving on, fossil fuels are a famous example of something that's wasteful and not sustainable. Slightly less well known is downcycling. Although it conserves some materials, after a few cycles they'll still end up in landfills, making it unattainable in the long term. Arguably, the only positive example in this case is sustainable and conserving. For example, circular economy. This simple exercise shows you how opening up a binary gives you different areas to explore further and helps you remain critical in the later stages of the analysis. In applied semiotics, we tend to distinguish between the residual, dominant and emergent codes, while remembering that it's not always as linear and culture sometimes tends to go back on itself to early ideas. Think of retro fashion trends, for example. In simple terms, residual codes are the ones that are becoming passé and obsolete. Dominant are the ones that are the most common at the moment and appear normal. And emergent are the trends which can be spotted on the peripheries of culture, manifested, for example, among influencers, thought leaders, or resonant startups. Let's keep all of this in mind as we explore how sustainability is changing. As the purpose of this video is not to discover anything groundbreaking about sustainability, but rather to show the semiotic perspective on the question, all images that I have chosen were a result of a very quick Google image search rather than a usual diverse dataset from various sources. Most of the ones on this slide were a result of searching sustainability, so it's safe to say it's mostly a dominant representation of the concept, at least on the English-speaking side of the internet. When we start looking at those images next to each other, what we're looking for is the similarities and the recurrent ideas that they communicate, as well as any interesting observations we can spot. From this first one, we can infer that sustainability is seen as an act of care. As we're holding the earth protectively in our hands, it's also clear here that the color green is closely associated with the concept, even synonymous with it, as in, think green. At the same time, it's not all about nature, as we can see a link to technology for the image with the light bulb, surrounded by different technological solutions which we hope can save the earth. This opposition of technology and nature seems to be a key theme, as the picture below it makes it quite explicit, showing the progress of green infrastructure like wind farms against the old, grey, industrial and mechanical order. Except, as we already know from the semiotic square, this narrative is in reality not as black and green as it initially seems. The tensions do exist. Already, from just a few images, we're starting to recreate a mental model of what sustainability could mean in our Western collective consciousness. However, that's only part of the story. As we start diving deeper to different contexts, we can see that the focus is changing a bit as well, like a variation on the theme. Searching for sustainable tourism reveals a new set of images. And so, it's no longer just about the greenery and nature, but more about the more holistic understanding of sustainability, which takes into account business models and how they impact the communities and people that live in tourism spots. Global ecological protection turns into respecting the beauty of local surroundings you visit and helping local communities thrive. From an exploitative, selfish practice, tourism becomes a driver for positive change. By putting money into the local economy rather than, for example, corporate chains. It's all about a meaningful connection to the place while thinking long-term, as implied by the travel forever or logo with an eternity symbol, through context and association reminding you about your carbon footprint as well. Next, let's move to architecture. On this slide, I tried to very simply show how the idea of sustainable architecture is changing through time, left to right. Sustainable architecture used to be predominantly focused on the renewable energies, especially solar panels. As they're quite bulky and visible, they used to send a signal that a family or a business cared about global warming. I'd say this is now on the verge of residual and dominant, and you'll see why later on in this video. Same goes for the idea of sustainable cities represented in the image below, understood as top-down technological planning by experts. Continuing the theme of technology as savior. This is contrasted with the more emergent, even though operating on the same plane, idea of placemaking as a bottom-up practice, where it's the community that possesses the knowledge of local context that can make the neighborhood more holistically sustainable and working for everyone. It brings to mind themes of locality that we've already seen in sustainable tourism. As you may have noticed, I'm also very slowly starting to go beyond just the bottom-up granular analysis of the images shown here, and incorporating some outside context of the top-down narratives in which they function. Another emergent idea is around designing architecture that blends in with nature rather than domineering over it. It's also borrowing cues from nature, like those beehive-like octagonal apartments which allow greater density of housing, or houses covered with local soil or grass. Lastly, let's have a look at some images associated with sustainable fashion. At first glance, what's really interesting here is how different this set looks from our first slide. Dominating green is replaced with pastels and earth tones instead. Part of this could be related to how the idea of greenwashing has become undesirable and synonymous with lack of meaningful change, as shown here. Even though a company might communicate sustainability with the right codes, it could still backfire if there is no action to back up the surface level messages. Another potential reason is the natural shades of fabric seen as sustainable, for example, linen or cotton. Either way, we're starting to see some more subtle ways of communicating the very same thing over and over again. We can also see here an example of vegan leather masking made of mushrooms as a direct solution to the tension we've seen through the semiotic square. Leather becomes both sustainable and conserving rather than wasteful. So semiotics can also help us reveal tensions that exist in culture, identifying problems that designers and future startups could potentially resolve for people. We can also see here the return of the idea of more holistic sustainability, where the business model and mode of consumption are taken into account. It's not just about the planet anymore, but also the whole supply chain, including the condition of the overseas workers. With that, we see that to really understand sustainability, we need to delve into other areas that surround it, bringing together different strands of meaning. In branding semiotics, we call it borrowing from other categories. For example, when a cosmetics company starts using design cues from medicine and apothecary, shapes of bowls being one obvious example, bringing new associations with them. Consciously or not, is how most innovation often happens. And so, sustainable fashion requires not only communicating the right ideas, but also changing customer behaviors, from buying cheaper fast fashion to conscious slow decision making. As a popular saying goes, style never goes out of fashion. In this last section, I just wanted to give you some quick examples of where sustainability might be heading. What's emergent? If you're a designer, you might have seen some of those trends already in the latest thought pieces or webinars. For example, the dominant paradigm of human-centered design is slowly being replaced with the environment or earth-centered design. Practitioners are recognizing that to survive and thrive, people need to remember that we're part of our ecosystem, rather than remain on the pedestal that we once put ourselves on. In other words, strive towards balance over dominance. We're also starting to talk about the importance of going back to the indigenous knowledge that was suppressed by colonialism and industrial revolution. Part of this narrative is the awareness that our Western culture might not actually be the best equipped to solve the very problems we've created, despite what the technocratic paradigm would like you to believe. We're the ones that forgot how to be the custodians of the earth. Indigenous people have never stopped trying to protect and sustain their native land. Thus, rather than simply learning from them, we should give them the power to continue their work, letting go of our hubris. Transparent solar panels are also the perfect example of how something that was previously very visible, as we've seen in sustainable architecture, might become in the future an integral part of our buildings. It's no longer meant to be seen or signaled, it just is. The future ideal is that sustainability becomes part of our lives rather than to be seen or signaled, it just is. The future ideal is that sustainability becomes part of our lives rather than something we strive towards. like to leave you with today, though, is that even the concept of sustainability itself is becoming old. Sustainability is not enough. What's emerging from it all are regenerative practices that strive to repair and leave the earth better than we found it. While sustainability will still exist in the dominant space, regeneration will continue to become more and more important in the future, soon overcoming it. I hope you can see now that making sense of complexity is possible. Semiotics and other sense-making methods can give you the tools you need to decode culture and society in order to see how we could encode it better, for example through purposeful conscious design. Thank you.